All right, we have 5:31, and we will try to be as expedient as possible as there's a kickoff happening at 6:10. So the first item on the agenda will be proposed changes to the policy file DCF fund balances. Mr. Guidry? And for this one, I think we want to see the year-end transfers out of the general fund.
Yes, for this particular item, it's made up of proposed revisions to our current policy file DCF relating to fund balance. So I thought we could take a look at that, and then from there go on to the second schedule, which deals with fiscal year end 17, where if depending on what direction the discussion heads in with regards to the policy, will determine if that schedule would be acceptable as a recommendation for the Finance Committee, or would need to be adjusted somewhat. So I'll go ahead and open up the marked up copy because it shows the changes that we're proposing. And the idea behind these changes, and these are the changes that are in blue, are basically to facilitate transferring funds out of the general fund once the 3-month level of expenditures has been funded through the Economic Stabilization Fund, and after recognizing a surplus of $100,000, just to report a surplus, any excess could be transferred to the self-funded construction fund and capital project improvement funds, and the board would determine there'd be 2 line items within those each of those 2 funds. The board would determine the amount that would get allocated to the first line item, which is named Committed School Site Renovations and Constructions. This particular account would basically be where we would accumulate funds for a lot of the projects that were on the tax initiative. It would be maintained here or kept here until utilized. The other account is the committed for fiscal year XX projects. So if we're in fiscal year 18, this would relate to fiscal year 19, where we're trying to put funds aside for the next school year to make sure that event sales tax collections go down. We still have funds to handle capital projects. So with any change to these requirements, requiring two-thirds of board vote, which is consistent with the voting requirement for the change of the 3 months. If the board wishes to change the 3 months to whatever, 2.5, 2 months, if that's their choice, or if the Finance Committee is willing to interested in recommending that, that would be, well, ultimately, I guess we go with the regular vote for Finance Committee, and then the board would, the 2/3 would apply there. So, with regards to the proposed changes to the policy file, I would ask or open it up for a discussion at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Guidry. And just to very briefly recap, at the previous Finance Committee, we had discussed changing the level at which our reserve fund was funded from 3 months to 2 months, 2.5 months, 2 3/4, some number in between there. And then subsequent to that, Mr. Guidry has come up with this wording, which would retain the 3 months when we still have the option of visiting that later, but retain the 3 months reserve fund. Anything above that, as we close out our books at the end of a fiscal year, would get transferred to the 2 accounts that he mentioned. So with that said, does anybody in the audience have any questions regarding this?
Hi, Ella Arsamon. I just wanted to say that I think it's a great idea to put money aside for future construction and stuff, but I'd also like to know, when y'all do decide that, how much will be allocated for maintenance of the new construction. I haven't heard that mentioned, and I just wanted to make sure that that was going to be taken into account.
Right now, Mr. Guidry, we allocate $2.5 million a year in sales tax funds to these two.
But if you also take from this reserve fund, can you pull a little bit more money from the reserve fund to add to the maintenance?
We can certainly
That's all would
we can
consider.
certainly increase the annual funding for maintenance when our sales tax collections recover to their levels from a few years ago. One of the things that this board did when we first took office was we reduced the funding of maintenance by $500,000 a year. Is that correct? And so, in an effort to avoid making cuts to the classrooms themselves, with the idea that once sales tax collections recovered, we would resume the full $3 million funding of maintenance, possibly more. But in the meantime, this is the excess money. Any excess money at the end of a fiscal year would be transferred into this fund. And I think it's worth saying, committed fiscal year XX can be used for maintenance, right? Because isn't that in the capital improvements?
Typically, what you would see there is once we get the capital request in, some of them are actually building maintenance requests because they don't meet the $25,000 threshold. So we take a look at it, the quantity, we total the estimated costs, and typically we'll identify a transfer from the capital fund to the general fund to cover some of those maintenance projects, because we can't expect our building maintenance budget in the general fund to pick up these borderline projects that when you have 10 or 15 of them, they add up pretty quickly. So to answer your question, yes, it could be transferred to the general fund when we're preparing the next year's budget for general fund.
Yes, Mr. Muto. Please go to the microphone. Will you go to the microphone, please? Thank you.
Butch Mouton. Just asking, where are we as far as getting to the level we were before the sales tax went down? Does anybody have any idea?
What are we? We dropped $9 million. We decreased by $9 million from 14 to 15. Is that right? Or 15 to 16?
In 15-16, we had our first significant drop, and then 16-17, we basically leveled off.
Right. We're still at the bottom.
So, yeah.
And so this is and when we get to the discussion at I think it's the next.
Yeah.
It's one of these items where we talk about what's actually excess for fiscal year 17. We're going to have an excess from the simple fact, not that tax collections increased, but that we budgeted a decrease. We budgeted a decrease that didn't happen. And so we are going to have an excess, not because tax collections have recovered, as much as they didn't keep going down.
Well, that was the question. Something there that was.
Right.
I got it.
Right.
Thank you.
Absolutely. There any other questions regarding this?
So if no further questions, we can go on to the next attachment, which takes a look at fiscal year 17. If we apply the proposed changes here to fund balance, this is what could potentially, or this is what we would recommend, administration would recommend happening. We're projecting a surplus in the general fund fiscal year 17 of $12,428,582. Now, of that $12.4 million, about $8 million were revenues, and again, that's based on the fact that we have typically budgeted flat, and not revising the budget when we see that collections are actually exceeding budget. It's a conservative approach to budgeting revenues. So that was not a surprise to us, because we saw that $8 million growing each month until it accumulated to $8 million. The other $4.4 million is basically our actual expenditures being less than what had been budgeted. mainly in the area of salaries and benefits. And what happens there is we're preparing the budget. We start in February, if not earlier, with staffing. And so by the time we're done, staffing is basically, for the most part, just getting started. So any retirements that occur at year end, those individuals are going to be replaced with employees who are on the other end of the lower end of the salary schedule. There's some savings there. If there are vacancies for a time period, there's some savings there. We had some savings in the transportation area because we had budgeted for the price of fuel to stay the same level, because we don't know what it's going to do from year to year. It's always easier to decrease than it is to try to find more money. And those really were the main reasons. Salaries and benefits was an area, when you look at all the different employee categories, and you have changes in personnel, especially at year end when there are a lot of retirements. It has an impact on the expenditures, and this year probably a little bit larger than it has been in previous years. So that makes up the other $4 million. So here's, based on this proposed fund balance, here's what could happen. A transfer to the OPEB trust, $750,000. Again, we're showing our efforts, although we're not keeping up with the funding that's recommended, we are showing an effort to put something into that trust. There's growing emphasis on this. I think we're going to start seeing more school boards follow suit as things get a little bit more serious in terms of how they're going to present this and what impact it might have on the financial reporting of our school districts when dealing with bond rating companies and things like that. Transfer to self-funded construction, $838,000. Transfer to capital improvements fund, $2,738,000. Typically, we try to keep those two funds pretty much in line. The reason why the capital improvement fund shows about a $1.9 million excess over the transfer to self-funded is these two line items here. We would like to, in 18-19, have $1 million set aside for science adoption textbooks and $900,000 in robotics for the middle, to get the robotics program in the middle and elementary schools. So what would end up happening is we would transfer it to capital improvements, and then when we go through the 18-19 budget process, move those funds, if the board so approves, into the general fund budget. So that's why that number is $1.9 million more than self-funded. That would leave us with a little over $8 million to transfer to that committed account, what we used to refer to as reserve, we now refer to as committed for school site renovations and construction. So let's take a look at what these transfers, the impact that it would have in these respective funds. Looking at self-funded, this 838, this is self-funded construction here. Typically for 18-19, we set aside, in this case, $2.6 million. Excess sales tax collections, $1.8 million. What happens is, just like we had the excess actual collections over budget and general fund, we have the same for some of that excess gets allocated to capital funds. 75% of the excess gets allocated to the capital funds. That's what we're seeing here. We're seeing the $1,836,000 here in the self-funded construction, and we're also seeing the $1,836,000 in the capital improvement funds. So that is that 75% excess that gets distributed at year end. Here are the transfers that are being referenced here. This 838 shows up here, and the $2,738,000 in capital funds shows up here. presented it in this format so we could see what our reserve or committed funds for 18-19 would look like. Typically, they're in, we, at a minimum, we try to set aside $2.5 million. That number used to be $3 million before sales tax collections went down. And it goes anywhere from that $3 million to $8 million, just depending on what our excess sales tax collections look like. So this puts us pretty much in the middle with regards to self-funded construction. It would put us at about a $5.3 million budget amount, and in capital improvements, it would put us at about a $7.3 million. But keep in mind that $1.9 million of that would be transferred to general fund if all of this is approved. So that gets us back to about the $5 million mark. The point being that is a great place to be when you consider what our sales tax collections have done over the last 2 years, and we've escalated the projects, completion dates of the projects. We're doing more projects than we typically have done. They've been assigned quicker, and they're being completed quicker. So those two, completing the projects quicker to where there's not as much carryover funds, and a reduction in sales tax collections over the past couple of years, it's a good place to be, where we still have a respectable amount set aside for 18-19. And then the $8 million too for the renovations, school site renovations and construction, we had already put $250 aside in the 17-18 budget. So that would put us at about $8.3 million with regards to that particular line item. Money set aside for those projects that were listed in the tax initiative. So with that said, I'll ask if there's any questions with regards to the information that's presented specifically for fiscal year 17, if we were to apply the proposed changes in policy file DFC.
Or
DCF.
Or either of the two, science adoption and robotics at the bottom that make up the 2.7, are either of those recurring expenditures?
The robotics, I think, would be a mixture. Some of it's startup, and some of it would be recurring. Would that be correct, Dr. Aguilar?
So the answer to that question is there will be a small amount of recurring expenses, yes.
What is small?
We are anticipating the use.
I'm not going to hold you to an exact number, but just, percentage-wise.
So, Shauna, the cost for the consumables for the printers was about how much money?
So $30,000 a year? That's small. Okay.
And then for the textbooks, it's one time, but then you have another.
Yeah, I know.
So
it's amazing. We keep buying textbooks every year, right?
Which sort of makes it recurring.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm concerned that maybe I don't want to. Our recommendation shouldn't be for the board to cement recurring. I mean, in the case of the $30,000, sure, but cement a recurring $1 million from this particular revenue stream.
I see.
In case they feel like maybe it's better to handle it one at a time or something along those lines.
Okay.
Does anyone have any questions about this? Go ahead.
Whichever one. They got robotics in middle and elementary. How many schools do we have for robotics, middle and elementary now? Or is that our goal to have it in every one of them?
So we have robots at Prairie Elementary School and at STEM.
Well, STEM does.
Paul Bro. We've got high school iterations of robotic classes at Como High School, Acadian High School, and David Thibodeau.
Right.
So in a nutshell, we're trying to introduce robotics into elementary and middle school environments.
Okay. Thank you.
Does anyone in the audience have any questions? All right, thank you, Mr. Guidry. I'll, let me make sure, let me read the recommended action on here. So we're gonna, I think, recommend the change to the policy file. How do you want to, is there going to be a separate agenda item on Wednesday to handle the specific transfer? How the transfer breaks down? Or is it handled, I mean, how you tell me how that works.
Well,
It would be a budget revision, right?
let's just assume for the time being that the proposed revisions are approved as is. Then we've already included those transfers as shown in the final revisions of the budgets that are included the same evening.
Okay.
If
all
that
right.
changes for any reason, we can change the revisions on that evening as well.
Okay. Should we, just out of curiosity, let me ask a question. Should we have, I know it says it will automatically be transferred to the self-funded construction and capital improvements fund. Will there always be required a board budget revision to facilitate that? Or would it go into specifically a uncommitted line item in those two budgets?
It would require board approval for a budget revision, just as it will Wednesday evening.
Okay.
Because the idea is we have a very limited time period to execute these transfers, and it still be reflected in fiscal year 17. So it'll probably be, the timing will probably be similar. It'll be, our September meeting, and once it's approved, we'll have a day or two to actually execute whatever the board approves in the budget revision, and it still be allowed to be recorded in fiscal year 17.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, then I'll move that Finance Committee recommend adoption of policy file DCF as proposed. Seconded by Mr. Broussard. Ms. Dorothy. Last chance for public comment on this item. Mr. Broussard.
Pretty simple question. Once the funds are transferred to the construction fund, is there any chance that it could be taken back out for any reason?
It can by a 2/3 vote of the board,
Okay.
which is similar to the way the language reads now. As it stands now, the money simply sits in the general fund, unbudgeted, whatever term you want to use. Right now, that money can be allocated to anything the board chooses with a 2/3 vote. So now it will go to the construction fund and would require a 2/3 vote on a budget revision, transferring that money from the construction fund to something else.
Okay.
I got that right, didn't I, Mr. Guidry? All right. If there are no other comments, then I'll call for the vote, Ms. Dorothy. Yeah, you do.
Three, four, and then
All right, next item is the self-funded construction budget revision for Lafayette High School replacement facility programming. Mr. Guidry?
Yes, our architectural firm has completed its initial facilities programming and has asked if the board would be interested in basically expanding the scope of that study for Lafayette High, where some of the options that are discussed in the initial programming would be expanded in detail. With some potential development opportunities for some of the properties the property that faces West Congress. So with the funding that was not expended on the first, there was about 10,000, I think, that was still available. They did not expend the full budgeted amount. We would need an additional 25,000, bringing it to an estimated 35 in order for that expanded scope of facilities programming to be completed. Of course, in that process would be a review, the architectural firm coming in and making a presentation of what they found in their preliminary facilities programming.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments from the audience on this? Mr. Broussard, Mr. Hidalgo, any questions? Then I'll move that the Finance Committee recommend the board approve the self-funded construction budget revision. Seconded by Mr. Hidalgo, Ms. Dorothy. I'm going to presume that there is still no public comment. Now call for the vote.
Three, four, none against.
Next item is a general fund budget revision, step increase in pay for performance stipend, Compass evaluated employees only. Mr. Guidry.
During the budget process for this fiscal year, we started taking a look at it in February, and so we have about 4 months of sales tax collections that we have to project. And with the actual projections that we have, I believe it's through the month of December, we didn't feel comfortable one way or the other projecting an improvement until we saw more months of improvement, so to speak. So we indicated that we would come back. We continue to look at it, monitor it from month to month, which we've done. So with hindsight, the benefit of hindsight, those 4 months, in essence, were improvements over the prior year's revenue collections, as well as not the month of July, that was pretty much break even, but the month of August, we've seen a slight increase in that particular month. So given that, and given the fact that we had not budgeted, our budget was less than actual collections for fiscal year 16-17. And we brought that same budget forward to 17-18, meaning that the actual collections in 16-17, over and above what was budgeted in 16-17, it didn't make it to the 17-18 budget, and we knew that. It wasn't something that came as a surprise. That was just a conservative approach to, again, the board's actions have reflected a commitment to making funds available for those capital projects. So now that we have more months of actual collections behind us in terms of the budget process, I prepared this analysis here to show that if the board was so interested, if the Finance Committee is so interested to make that recommendation, we feel that there'd be adequate funding to fund the step increase that is currently not reflected in the adopted budget for 17-18. So let's take just a quick look at the revenue sections to see why I'm saying that in terms of the revenues. So if you take a look at column D here, you'll note that in fiscal year 17, the property tax collections came in at 2.2 million over and above what had been budgeted. Here's the fiscal year unaudited numbers for fiscal year 17, actual. Here's the budget. Here's the excess. If you look or compare what we budgeted in 18 the current year, to that of 17, actual collections, you'll notice for the most part, we recognized all of that increase and then some, to the tune of about $90,000. The point being is the increase that we recognized in fiscal year 17 is reflected in the fiscal year 18 budget. So that money is not available in fiscal year 18. It's available, but it's already included in the budget that we've adopted. Now, in speaking with the tax assessor, he's indicated that we should not anticipate a significant increase, if any increase at all, over last year. Not anticipating a decrease, but no material increase over last year. So where we are is basically we have budgeted, or the fiscal year 18 budget reflects the increase or excess collections in 17 over 17 budgets. When you get to sales taxes, that's not the case. You'll notice that the actual collections for 17 was $69,346,459. We had budgeted $65,972,402 for a 3.3 or $3.4 million excess actual over budget. Well, we budgeted in 18 the same amount that we budgeted in 17. We budgeted flat. So because of that, that 3.4 million has not been reflected in the current year budget. It wasn't reflected last year, and that's part of the 12.8 million or 12.4 million that we talked about earlier, and it's not reflected in the current year's budget. When you look at MFP, MFP is tied to a budget letter that goes out. You'll notice in 17, the actual collections exceeded what we had budgeted by about $1 million, $980,000. Currently, we can only budget what we know. So we don't have the 10-1 counts yet. We don't have the February counts yet. And it's those counts that generate this type of excess or deficit, just depending on what our student counts are doing. So for the time being, we budgeted what's in the budget letter provided by the Louisiana Department of Education. We've also had some non-recurring revenues. Remember, when I was explaining the 12.4 million surplus for 17, I said there was about an $8 million excess in revenues. I wanted to be able to show where that $8 million is. It doesn't take very many line items because our main collections are property taxes, sales taxes, and MFP, state funding. In this particular case, there was a Medicaid outreach administrative program, generated $857,716. I believe the year before that amount was about $3,000. From year to year, it just fluctuates depending on what funding the state makes available, and that's dependent on what funding the federal government makes available. So typically, you have Medicaid behavioral health. You have Medicaid for ESP services, and if there's anything left in the federal funding, they make it available for this administrative outreach program. So for that one, we did not budget anything in the fiscal year 18, nor had we budgeted anything last year, because each year, or just about each year, we get comments indicating this program, there's a good chance that this program will not continue on into next year. So we don't see any point in budgeting for it. If it happens, it's great. It provides funding for us to look at one-time expenditures. We had a state appropriation, Act 14, one-time allocation. So because of that, we did not budget it. We weren't anticipating that amount when we were budgeting for 17, because that did not happen till later during the year. And then we did not budget it in 18 because it was in fact a one-time statutory allocation. And then all of our other revenue accounts, and there are many, net to about 420,000, of which they're non-recurring or fluctuating. It's difficult if you see a revenue go up by 10 or 15%, but the year before it went down 25%, it's not an increase that we're comfortable budgeting. So we're going to take a conservative approach there. So for those, we basically didn't budget anything in terms of increases. So that shows how the 8.5 million, or roughly the 8 million 17, what created it, and it also shows that we have about $3.4 million of sales tax revenues. If our sales tax collections do not remain the same as 17, don't increase, don't decrease, that would be available. And we're saying it would take about 60% of that amount to fund the step increase. Step increase is projected to cost about, step increase and pay for performance increase is projected to cost, with benefits, about $2 million. With that, I'll open it up to any questions anyone may have.
So by my guerrilla math, we could experience about a 2% decrease in sales tax collections and be okay?
2%, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Just joking with Mr. Cole out front, Mr. Hidalgo, that maybe we should grant the step increase as a one-time bonus check. What do you think? You think that's a good idea? Yeah. Do you have any questions?
Yeah. Mr. Guidry, what is pay for performance stipend?
That's the that's the description used for the pay for our full-time employees who are rated through a Compass system, a Compass software system, which in essence are most of our classroom teachers. So it's Compass rated employees who are full-time. It's just a different name for their pay increase.
I just thought it was a different. It was a bonus type thing for certain teachers who achieve greater than the others.
That's the name for their increase instead of the step. And I would mention that it is 1 year of step. It's not trying to catch up last year. It's the current year's step.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Last year we had initially did not approve the step increase, and then subsequently came back and I think gave a portion of it. This year, same thing. We didn't initially approve it. However, this is a way to, good faith way to approve it. Correct?
Yes, but I would say that the way that we addressed it last year was a stipend, which means that didn't repeat this year. So our employees got a prorated amount of the step that they would have recognized last year, but when we moved to this year, that was not in their base pay. So then that step got removed, or they didn't get the benefit of it, and they didn't get the benefit of a second year. So although it was a partial offset last year, this year we're looking at 2 years worth of no increases because that stipend's a one-time payment.
It's progressive. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? All right, then I'll move that the Finance Committee recommend to the Board approval of this general fund budget revision in the amount of $2 million. While she gets that, Mr. Guidry, the remaining, if I can read it correctly, the remaining what's the remaining recurring sales tax revenue? We just funded $2 million, so it's 1.5, 1.4?
1.4.
Yeah. What will is that going to remain unbudgeted for this
Until the board chooses to revise it upward or downward, it would remain at 1.4.
Okay,
yes.
so the sales tax revenue line item in the budget will now read 67,972,402.
It will be the 65,972. Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
That is correct.
3, 4, and none against.
All right, next item is the local fuel supplement for contract bus drivers. Mr. Guidry.
Yes, we've had a recent rerouting beginning of this school year of all of our bus routes. And this has resulted in a significant decrease in the number of miles driven by some of our contract drivers. And basically, based on our calculations, for a contract driver to be able to manage to operate their bus, they need to be at least at 40 miles a day of driving, both ways. So a total of 40 miles a day. And out of our, say, 52 or so contract drivers, initially, approximately half were under the 40. So it prompted us to take a look at what could be done to mitigate or get them closer to the operational allowance needed to keep their bus on the road. So what we're proposing here is that there is a local fuel adjustment that's part of the operational reimbursement calculation. And we're proposing that the board authorize the superintendent to increase that amount, given the fact that there would be an offsetting decrease somewhere within the transportation budget to offset it, to give the superintendent some flexibility on dealing with this particular issue as we move forward through the school year. They're still working on the routes in that there's a couple of, I think, an ESL and gifted program. So we're still waiting to see what the final results are with regards to these mileages by driver. But so until we have that, it would be difficult to to quantify what kind of increases we're looking at. So we thought, just to give you a frame of reference, for every $100,000 of savings that we are reallocate, every $100,000 of funds that get reallocated from one line item in the transportation budget towards this local fuel adjustment would increase the local fuel adjustment by 16 cents, which would generate about 125 on the low end in terms of low mileage spectrum, about $125 more a month, or $1,500 a year. And on the high end, it would generate about $183 a month, or $2,200 a year. Again, just to give us an idea. So for every 100,000 we would identify of reallocation, superintendent would be able to increase it if he so chose, if he saw it as being to the benefit of the school system and the drivers, 16 cents.
Thank you. I'll just give a brief explanation. Dr. Aguilar and I discussed this, and I mentioned to him that he already has the authority through board policy to make line item adjustments within a cost center in the school system's budget. And then he mentioned that the board actually set the reimbursement rate for the fuel supplement, and so I suggested that they bring this item to us so that we could authorize him to set that supplement rate, because regardless, he can't change the total amount in the cost center. So if the money's there and it can be better used to have the buses operate better, then I think it's totally within his prerogative. So with that said, does anyone have any questions? Mr. Broussard?
What was the average loss that we know so far per contract driver? What was the average dollar loss? Or I saw it earlier to say what the yearly cost. What is the average so far that we know?
I can say this: of all of the contract drivers, you had roughly half, a little bit better than half, that had 40 or more miles, 40 to 60 miles, basically, with the new routes. So that kept them close to the average of what was there before. Not quite as much, but at least adequate to run their bus and still still have some money left over after. And roughly half decreased. The lowest was 25 miles, and of those that didn't reach 40, the lowest was 25, the highest was 39.1, so they were right on the edge. Since that time, I believe 5 of them have been addressed where they're over 40, some of them over 50 now as the gifted programs were added, some of the changes that were made after the school year began. So we're just waiting to see. We're very close to seeing how many of the remaining 19 drivers where they will be once it's completely done. But that would give you an idea of the range. That $25, 25 miles a day is probably equates to about $9,000 a year away from that 40 miles break-even point, just to give you a rough idea. For that one person, there was only one driver, and that one has since been corrected. That person's over 40 now.
Mr. Guidry, would this essentially supplement just those 19 drivers, or all contract drivers would be eligible for the additional portion?
They would all be eligible.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One more time, any questions from the public? Then I'll move that the committee recommends to the board authorize the superintendent to increase the local fuel supplement portion, bus operational reimbursements. Can't vote on this? All right. Click that abstain button. All right, Ms. Dorothy, we're ready to vote when you are.
Two for, one abstain.
Next is 2.5 snap raise. Mr. Guidry, is there any urgency in hearing this evening? Can we wait another month for this? If there's urgency, we'll hear it, but
This wasn't my agenda item, so I'm really not certain of the urgency. It's a fundraising opportunity. So with the football season, athletics, kicking off this past month, there could be some urgency to it, but I don't think it would be devastating.
Whose agenda item is it?
I believe it was generated through from Northside, I believe.
Is that right?
Yeah. It's very similar to Donors Choose with a few exceptions.
Well, I'll tell you what. Why don't we do this? If the committee doesn't mind, we'll just send it to the board without a recommendation. And if Dr. Chasson would like to cover it on Wednesday night, you'd certainly be welcome to. Is that all right with you? All right. Something like that, yeah. And then next one is substitute bus driver long-term pay, Mr. Veed.
Sir, Caleb Veed, Assistant Human Resources. We brought this up in one of the things that we're trying to do to recruit more school bus drivers, among advertising both in print and online, some marketing work as well that we're trying to do. We figured it would help on our end if we could reduce the number of consecutive days that we wait before we pay a school bus driver to get a long-term rate. This agenda item actually does two things. It reduces that time from 10 days to 5 days. It also removes the stipulation that they must work for the same driver over those 5 days, to where they would just be working for 5 days before they get the long-term pay. After going through last year, it looks like it would be an increase of around $14,000 with benefits. if we keep the same number of subs throughout the year from last year.
Total.
Total.
All right. That seems reasonable. Mr. Dago?
Yeah, given the shortage of drivers, and I know that this is a major issue, what is the difference in day rate?
It from regular day rate to long term, it's $31.45. Between the regular rate is 56 something. The long term rate is $87.90. So it's about $31.45.
Absolutely, and I've heard from many folks that this is a major issue for them, especially the on that pay grade. Is there a problem with eliminating the days altogether? I mean, we're in that much of a shortage. I would be in favor of eliminating the days altogether. So we pay a
if
bus
we're-
driver this amount to drive, whether they're full-time or a sub, because right now we have too many full-time drivers, taking the day off, yeah.
So we're talking about $14,000 total at $31 a day. So, man, my math ain't working so well right now.
Well, if it cuts it from 10 to 5, so double it,
Yeah,
28,000.
yeah.
I spoke with transportation today about not having the days. They prefer 5 days there because then a substitute can't just take off a day or 2 days in order to keep that pay. So like if they would miss 2 days, they have to start over the 5 days so they don't miss. It's just an incentive for them to maintain
Right.
their
Well, that
Very
makes
good point.
sense. That makes sense from an administrative standpoint, but when people get phone calls saying your bus is not running tomorrow, get your kids to school, and the difference is a $30 a day driver who may say, yes, I want that route, I would rather pay it. So,
No,
Yeah.
they want you to pay it. They just want to keep the 5 days so that they don't ever stop working.
right, but it's 10 now.
Right,
So,
They're all for going to 5.
Counterintuitively, I think.
trying to help them here.
No, I understand you are, but I'd say counterintuitively, I think what she's saying is that going to zero may have the opposite effect of what you're saying you want, and that it may encourage less substitute bus driving because now they can choose not to drive for a day and come right back and make the same amount of money, whereas right now, well, certainly even with the 5, they have the incentive to drive multiple weeks consecutively. Well, right, you have to drive a week before you get the increased pay, and then you don't want to blow it, right? I think her point is that, it makes more sense supply and demand-wise to increase the pay. You're going to increase the number of people that want to do the job, but at the same time, you're going to increase the number of people who will take a day off, leading to the exact situation that you just mentioned. So, thank you, Ms. Thibodeau. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
I mean, in the rerouting of what we done last month to start school, how many drivers did we lose?
As in sub or overall full-time?
Full-time, part-time, overall, just overall. And what is the problem of getting those back, given that we sort of missed the mark in trying to do something better?
Overall,
Most of those drivers that drives for us are retired or semi-retired or just trying to make gas money or something. It is that difficult to get them back?
yes, sir. It's not just that, but once someone retires, there are also stipulations on their retirement whenever they come back, that they have a earnings limit that they can only make so much once they retire. People who resign, depending on their reason for resigning, we still offer them to come back and sub, even though it won't be full time, but at least come back and sub whenever we need them. In the meantime, just last year we've had probably about 129 people who we have paid as a substitute bus driver during the year. We wind up at any one time with about 35 to 40 people that stay consecutively with us during the year. So we do have a lot of in and out with the bus drivers, and we're trying to get to where we can have a more steady and a bigger population of our sub drivers, which will eventually lead to us having more full-time drivers.
May I ask a question real quick? How many, if I work for 7 days as a sub driver, and then for whatever reason we don't need a sub driver that day, right? I'm willing to work, but the school system doesn't need me. Do I maintain my?
We do have
My
what's
full
called
pay?
a continuity administrative rule for continuity of pay, which if there's anything that would cause someone to not work for that day, in fact, even if somebody has to take a sick day or they have an emergency, it's usually at the school, but the director of transportation could request that we keep their continuity so that their pay doesn't drop just for that one thing, such as we didn't need a driver for that day.
Thank
so
you.
they could.
Mr. Brousseau, to answer your question, last year we had 284 active bus drivers, and right now we have 229 active bus drivers. 229 this year, right now. We're trying to recruit, but
Yeah, how many more are we looking for?
we would like to hire 10, is what I'm told, 10.
So we won't wind up with the same number we had last year, even though we cut in the budget.
Right.
That we asked to cut the transportation budget. We're not going back to where we were last year.
Right.
Okay, all right.
There are no more questions. I'll move that the committee recommends that the board approve this change. And we're ready to vote when you are, Miss Dorothy. Sorry, I was reading the.
Three, for, none against.
Thank you. And the final item is a budget insert for the unified budget, which was, and I'll just give a brief introduction, Mr. Guidry also discussed at the last Finance Committee meeting a manner of presenting our financial information in a clear, easy to understand format, and making it easy for people to, or the citizens of Lafayette Parish, to determine what our total revenue is, what our total expenditures are, what our cost per student is, even with a nice chart that shows the breakdown. So with that said, Mr. Guidry, I'll give you some immediate feedback. We have, what I'm looking for is what is second on this page. And I'll make this point that we ran into this issue in the run-up to the tax election in April, where there was information being circulated that stated we spent $17,000 per student. You and I both know that's not anywhere in the ballpark. However, if you take $510,000 or $510 million, right, and we divide that by 29,000, we get $17,586 per student. Now, if we take $333 million, 128,096, and divide it by $29,000, we get $11,487, which is a little closer. But you and I, we also understand that in that 333 is going to be our Title I funding, correct? Like our federal funding as
That's
well.
part of it, yes.
Federal funding, the money we collect for. Oh no, I see school food
That's in
service.
this item here. But what the schedule does is it takes our unified budget as approved by the board, which is this top section here, and then which totals 510 million. And there's a tendency, as you mentioned, by some folks to take that number and calculate a per pupil amount. The next section explains why that is not an accurate calculation. You have a lot of you have two main things happen. You have supplemental funding, which is the special revenue fund here. And that's the full 24,116,114. Well, almost all but $4 million. And this is supplemental funding, meaning if that funding went away, programs would continue, just not the supplemental programs. These programs have to be over and above what we're required to provide. So that's why it's being backed out. It's supplemental. With regards to capital improvements, I indicate that there is redundancy in the capital improvements fund, in the self-funded construction fund, in the 2016 construction fund, in the Southside High construction fund. Here's why. If let's say we're looking at the capital improvements fund, this one here. We have a budget of $12,162,166, and I'm backing out as redundant $8,162,666. Each year, we're basically putting aside that $2.5 million that we talked about, right? And then we have about another $1.5 million of the 75% surplus that comes in. That's $4 million. The way we get up to $12 million, $22 million, when we're budgeting a project, the first year we budget the full amount. Those funds have to be set aside to make sure that they're not set aside for another project. So let's say we have a $5 million project, and it doesn't start till April. Well, we budget the full $5 million, and we only spend $1 million. Well, the next year, it's brought over into the capital improvements budget as a $4 million project until it's completed. So it's being counted multiple times. So what we're doing here is we're backing out the redundancy. What's actually available for expenditures in each given year is the money that we've set aside for projects for that year. The $2.5 million and the 1.5, that number will fluctuate, of excess sales tax collections. So that's why we back out the redundancy for capital improvements. It happens the same way in self-funded. For 2016 construction and Southside High, the redundancy is caused for a different reason. These two amounts, the first year of Southside High was budgeted for, we put the full budget in there, $78 million, right? So, second year, whatever was left, we put that amount in there. So we have that going on. And then in the debt service fund, we're going to start paying the debt on that. So it's almost like, think of your home. You're recording the cost of your home in one fund, and you're recording your monthly note payments, the annual that you made that year in another fund. Well, you're recording it twice.
Which brings us to the ultimate problem, is I think we focus too much on the expenditure side in this top line analysis, and not so much on the revenue, because so we end up with 510,069 because everybody here knows that if you buy a $500,000 house, it doesn't mean your salary went up by $500,000 that year. It just means that you pledged future salary to gain $500,000 this year and agreed to pay back $800,000 over the course of whatever the term of your mortgage is. My point is that if all we did was listed every penny we collected this year for fiscal year 18, or every penny we expect to collect for fiscal year 18, it would equal that 333 down there at the bottom. Or right, I mean, whatever the number is, whatever year we're talking about. If all we did was said, here are the dollars we have coming in from recurring revenue, because there's no way legally for us to spend more than we collect in recurring revenue plus the sale of bonds, right?
Right.
Which, in the case you're saying about the debt service fund, we're paying back the debt here, and then we're also listing the full amount that we borrowed here.
Correct.
In two separate funds. So if we just listed revenues, federal money, state MFP, local property taxes, local sales taxes, food service, what else do we collect?
Well, the special revenue funds we collect there as well.
Well, which I meant federal, right? So
But keep in mind, you're still going to have some of those same redundancies because of the way it flows.
Even the money even in the collections?
Yes. Some, like, for example, sales tax collections come into the general fund, and they're transferred to debt service.
Well, forget about the general fund. Forget about any of the funds. Just, what did we collect this year? Right? I mean, we're sitting, how much money was deposited in our checking account? That's what I'm saying. And this is all great information that needs to be listed. I'm more or less picking at the order of it all, where when someone takes a look at this and we say budget summary, literally 510 divided by 29,000. And I mean, how can we possibly tell them they're wrong? It's right there on the document that we put out. So what I'm saying is the first number needs to be total amount of money we collected, total number of students we have. It needs to be what ends up. It needs to be that $11,229. That's what it needs to be. The first, and then we can get into all this other stuff. Is great. Like, this is all really great information that I think we need to make a point of putting out every year. But we need to certainly focus on simplicity at the very top.
But the issue, and I agree with you, but the challenge becomes we've got requirements from an accounting standpoint, from generally accepted accounting principles, that those budgets have to be prepared, and so we have to get to the 333 million somehow.
Sure.
In essence, this allows us to address. In order to get to the 333. We're pretty much going to have to go through some of the same calculations, because all of this is running through our funds, and we're going to say, well, wait a minute, okay, it's collected here, and it's also recorded here, so that's a redundancy. Even if we do revenue, we're still going to have to go through, maybe not show it, but we're still going to go through this exercise.
Well, which is my point, because we're talking about this going into the management's discussion section, right? And do we have the restrictions, the CAFR restrictions applied to the management's discussion? I mean, I know we can't put things in there that are false, but I mean, do we have formatting and accounting restrictions? What are those like? Categories that are there have to be there. Okay. Okay.
And so for those items, we need budget, to coincide with it.
I got you.
We're basically trying to take what we're required to report, because that's tiable to the CAFR, or will be at some point in time once the CAFR is done. And it's also what we're presenting to the board to be adopted. So I understand what you're saying, and I understand we have different readers, viewers looking at this. But if we start, let's just take group health as an example. You've got that 51,384,000 down here that's shown as a redundancy, and that's because the board and the employees, that 51 million is board contributions and employee contributions. That is and interest income. So so in the general fund, these are recorded as expenses. The board contribution is recorded as contribution to group health plan. The employee's contribution is recorded as salary expense. So it's recorded there, and then we're required to report to account for the group insurance fund within the general fund. We record it again as a revenue, so we can keep track, and with reason, we need to keep track of how that group health fund is doing. It's collected the $51 million. How much has been expended? Is that self-insured fund healthy? Is it where it needs to be? So there's reasons for it. I'm not being critical, but it results in a redundancy.
How so? On page, and this is the 16. This is the 15-16 CAF. So fiscal year 16 CAFR, page 9, which is, if you're looking at it electronically, it's page 35. And I wish I could put it up on the screen for you, but it's the Lafayette Parish School System Statement of Activities. And I'm sure you and Matt both know what I'm talking about. Here are the lines on there. So it says governmental activities, and it has two columns, 2016, 2015. It says program revenues, general revenues, total revenues. And inside those program revenues is charges for services and grants and contributions. General revenues, it says property taxes, sales and use taxes, state equalization, other general revenues. And it comes out with total revenues $342 million, $601,237. That's what I want to put. That's what I want to put at the top, right there. It's in the CAFR right now. It was something that we have to tell people to go dig out of the CAFR, but it would be much more helpful if we were to say put something there, because it says total revenues and then it says total expenses, and that is an exceptionally easy, digestible thing for someone glancing at it to understand.
And think of the timing. The CAFR is being prepared after the year is over, and the budget's being prepared before the year begins.
Sure.
So those numbers aren't available until the year is over.
Those numbers aren't budgeted?
Those are actual.
Well, right, but I mean, when we have the budget, we can put the budgeted numbers, can't we?
Well, we can take these budgets and plug them into that format, and arrive at those numbers with, so yes, it's not a format that we're required to report for audit purposes, or and I've never seen it in a budget book before, but it's not to say we can't do it.
And maybe we don't put it in the budget book. Maybe we put it in the CAFR every year.
Oh, and we do. That is.
Well, I know you do. I'm saying this particular insert right here.
Yeah.
We're getting there. This is a really good first pass at this.
So here's the idea. At the very bottom, once you back out the redundancies and the supplemental funds, we calculate a general fund per pupil amount, because comment was made at the last meeting, rightfully so. We have all these per pupil amounts. That's because we have different people calculating it using different numbers. So let's use a general fund and calculate it. 9,473. Let's look at special revenues. Capital improvements, 138 each. Sales tax, 43. School food service, 468. 2002 1/2 cent sales tax, 834. That gets you to 11,229. The point being is, regardless of what number you're grabbing, it's going to be one. It should be one of these.
Right.
And whether you decide, in a person's opinion, that wait, it should be the total, or no, it should be the sum of general fund and 2002 tax and capital, then it's there. My request would be, if you're going to compare it to other school districts, then make sure you're pulling those numbers as well, that it has the capital number in it, because typically it's only going to have the general fund number in it. If I call someone from another school district in the business department and ask them for per pupil, I'd say it's 75% chance, if not better, that I'm going to get general fund, because that's how we communicate. Because we know the rest is all over the place. To try to get it to apples and apples requires these
general
calculations.
Fund. That's right.
So, and then besides that, these are actual calculations. Besides that, the rest are sample sheets where we start slicing and dicing the general fund to show how much of the general fund relates to salaries and benefits and all the other different expense line items, with the focus being on expenses that are almost fixed, have very little variable cost to them. The next one groups it by function, where you look at direct instruction, instructional support, school administration, transportation. Gives you a little different slicing and dicing, and that would also be pie charted. After that, we take a look at the breakdown of salaries and benefits within the general fund. Of that 74% in this particular sample, how much of it's direct instruction? That allows the board to see that the lion's share of salaries and benefits is in the classroom. So this information would be applied to our school district, and the board could ask questions accordingly. It also lets you take a look at percent changes and dollar changes from one year to the next. Why has this increased? Why has this decreased? It facilitates those types of questions. And then there's been there's been requests for FTEs. So we'd have a summary for our school district, previous year that we're budgeting, so that any increases or decreases there could be questioned as well. Or if nothing else, it shows that it's holding steady. When, not a whole lot of positions are being added, so on and so forth. And you had mentioned in the previous Finance Committee meeting, there were some discussions about 10 frequently asked questions. And so the idea came up that if we didn't address one of those 10 in the previous schedules that I just reviewed, we have all of these flags. This might just be interesting bits of information that we want to include. How many school sites does our school district consist of? How many high school graduates? How many network computers are on a 1-to-1 ratio? Where are they? How many meals do we serve annually, breakfast and lunch? How many miles for buses? How many routes? How many miles driven? The numbers are staggering. And if nothing else, it would show that, when you're looking at that $510 million budget, there is a lot going on that makes up that $510 million. And it explains the breakdown in the FTEs, the people that you need and why you need them. But this could be adjusted to reflect whatever frequently asked questions the board members are getting. They're shared with us, and we put it on one of these flags and include it in our budget insert. And that basically what we have as a working document right now. And we would invite comments so that we can begin fine-tuning and wrapping up, putting a final product together, an insert together that you would approve of.
Despite my picking, this is a really good, really fine effort.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Do we have any comments from? Come on up. Mr. Broussard was at the last meeting where we started this discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Centeni. I would agree with your last comment that this is certainly a great move in the direction of providing more transparency to a very complicated process, in particular the CAFA reporting. And it's really great to see it looked at this way. One of the key things that I first, when I was looking at the CAFA reporting last year, or earlier this year, was the use of the word duplicate at some point when we were trying to break out the unified budget versus how the per pupil student calculation was made. And I see now that we're using the word redundancy, and that's one of the things that caught my attention. The word duplicate caught my attention. Is a little puzzling, is why would we be duplicating the way that we're capturing amounts? So in the effort of continuing to be transparent with the way that these numbers are put out, I would encourage us to come up with a better way to reference the way we're backing out amounts from the unified budget, so that it's better understood by a layman that may be picking this up and drawing conclusions. The word redundancy leads you to believe that there's some inefficiency in some kind of a process. So I'm thinking that, if we maybe looked at perhaps reading it in a phrase instead of the word redundant, like captured in prior years perhaps, or captured in prior budget sessions, to give it more meaning, so that the person will draw their conclusion down to the $333 million and not want to stay up at the $510 million.
Isn't it, Mr. Guidry, true that we have basically this redundancy or duplication is the difference in expenses and revenues captured all the same way? Is that so? Like you were saying earlier, we got the 2016 construction fund, which is technically a revenue, even though we're not going to be spending it this year. Let's say we had the $78 million. We had the full budget for Southside High School, and we had that in there as a revenue, even though there's no way we were going to spend all $78 million in that fiscal year. And then in addition, we had the expenditure associated with that revenue at $6 million, whatever the debt service was. So isn't part of it that we are backing out I don't even know what a good word is for an expense that we're not actually going to incur in this fiscal year?
And in essence, it's being recorded in two different funds. One as a transfer out, which is an expense,
Right.
and the other one as when they actually do the construction, it's recorded as an expense again there.
Right.
So again, we get back to just the way that we're required to report things, from a governmental standpoint.
And LCG has the same problem. I've looked at their CAFR. They, if you wanted to do top line, addition and say, well, the school system's $510 million and LCG is $600 million. If you look at their CAFR, and you'd say, well, I mean, Lafayette Parish government's $1.1 billion a year, and I promise you, we don't pay $1.1 billion a year in taxes.
So if the school system was not utilizing the CAFR reporting process, which, as I appreciate, is an accreditation to a higher standard of reporting, it would only be reporting this bottom section, right? You would not, only the $333 million. If you were not reporting in your budget summary the full the CAFR reporting, is that correct?
Yes, and to a certain extent, but keep in mind when we refer to CAFR reporting, we're talking about generally accepted accounting principles. We're talking about getting a unqualified opinion. So, and it's also it's geared towards that, and it's also geared towards our annual financial reporting that's required by the state.
I think Mr. Calder left too early.
Which takes the CAFR information and reshuffles some of the, it's probably not a good term, but
there are no good terms.
Reports the accounts in groups them into different categories, but nonetheless, at the end of the day, you come out to the same numbers. And so if we do that for both actual and budget. So that forces us to have a budget for each of those line items that we report to the state. So it's CAFR, to answer your question, and it's also state reporting. So it's both of those.
Well, I appreciate. I think Mr. Broussard may be on the right track. If we have no option but to arrive at the 333, we're going to be backing something out somewhere, right? If that's the case, then perhaps we should focus on how to list it, so that it's very clear what's going on there, and not just, they say it's 510 and then they subtract a whole bunch of stuff and then they say it's 300.
We want to meet with Bert? Sure. Mm-hmm. I mean, we could schedule a brief meeting, have Mr. Calder come and meet with whoever's interested.
Okay.
And talk about terminology, basically.
Okay. Well, let's do that, and then next month we can revisit the topic and see what we come up with. And in the meantime, if anybody has any,
But this is really good work, especially
I agree.
the breakout by fund.
Yeah.
I mean, that is.
I wish I had this.
We had it. Smart.
All right. Well, we'll keep at it, and we'll get there. We'll get there eventually, Mr. Guidry, and I'm sure Mr. Dugai helped with this. Thank you very much for your hard work on this front. And that said, if no one has anything else, we'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you.